Lakota chief lost the key to his wife's old chest. A settler widow picked the lock and was loved. The chest sat in the corner of my lodge for 3 winters before I stopped seeing it. That is what grief does. It makes the thing that hurts you so familiar that your eyes learn to pass over it, the way they pass over a stone you have stepped around 10,000 times. Morning light would come through the smoke hole and fall across that cedar chest, copper hinges gone green, a small iron lock no bigger than my thumb, and I would pull on my moccasins and walk out without looking at it. Not because I was brave. Because looking had become a kind of thing you could not afford to do before sunrise when there was a day ahead of you, and people counting on your face to be steady. My name in English is Standing Elk. Among my own people it is something longer, a name given at 13 winters after a thing that happened near a creek north of the Black Hills, but I will not tell that story here. I am old enough now that the long name belongs mostly to ceremony, and Standing Elk is what the traders called me, what the agent wrote in his ledger, what she called me the first time she needed to call me anything at all. Her name was Maren Holst, Norwegian by blood, Dakotan by stubbornness and misfortune, widow by the summer of 1882 when her husband Tor took a fever that moved fast through the settlements along the river and did not spare a man because he was young, and had 200 acres of broken sod and a wife who needed him. She had a boy, 8 years old, skinny, with his mother's pale hair and his dead father's habit of going very quiet when something frightened him. The boy's name was Emil, and he stepped in a trap someone had forgotten about in the creek bed below the cottonwoods, and the bone cracked clean through at the ankle. Someone brought him to me because it was that or ride 2 days to the army surgeon, and I had set bones before. That is the first time I saw her. She came through my door without asking, the boy in her arms, and she looked at me without any of the usual stiffness the settlers carried when they came to us for something. She looked at me the way a woman looks at a man when she is beyond ceremony, and down to the place where only the thing in front of her matters. She said, "Can you help him?" Not a question. She knew I could or she would not have come. I looked at the ankle, bad but clean. I told her to hold him still and she held him still. The boy screamed once and then went quiet in that way he had, and she did not flinch or look away. She kept her hands on his shoulders and her face close to his face, and she talked to him in a low mix of Norwegian and English that I could not follow, some old comfort from before the new world, and her voice did not shake. I set the bone, wrapped the ankle in river willow and deer sinew, told her he could not walk on it for 6 weeks, and she nodded like 6 weeks was something she could manage alongside everything else she was already managing, which turned out to be true. She paid me with a sack of cornmeal and 3 pounds of salt pork, and she thanked me without making it into something larger than it was. I appreciated that. Gratitude that is too large becomes a kind of debt that sits between people and makes them awkward with each other. Hers was plain and direct, and she left. I thought that was the end of it. In the weeks that followed, I would hear about her from the other men. She was breaking sod herself. She had hired a Sioux boy from the lower camp to help her, paid him fairly, did not treat him like he was less than what he was. The boy Emil was healing well. I knew that because his mother had sent back the wrappings I'd used with a note thanking me again, written in a careful hand on the back of a seed catalog page, the only paper she had. I held that note for a moment longer than I needed to before I set it down. I did not examine why. There was a council that fall. Long, difficult. The government men came with their papers and their mouths full of words and their eyes that did not quite meet yours when the words were biggest. I sat through 3 days of it and came home with a heaviness that had nothing to do with the council and everything to do with the fact that when I walked into my lodge the chest was there in the corner the way it always was. Her name was Walks with Thunder, my wife. She had been gone 4 years by that fall. A sickness that moved through the camp in a winter so cold that the river froze to the bottom in places, and she went in February, a Sunday, before the light came all the way up. She was 31 years old. We had been together since she was 17 and I was 22, and she had never been anything in those 14 years but exactly herself. Sharp and funny, and sometimes infuriating, and mine in the way that a person can be yours without belonging to you, which is the only real way. The chest was hers, cedar brought by her grandmother from somewhere east of the Missouri. Inside it, I knew without looking, were the things she kept: a piece of blue ribbon, some letters in a script I could not read that her grandmother had written, a small carved horse, cottonwood, that I had made for her our first winter, bad work, the legs too thick, the key she always wore on a cord around her neck, and that cord was around her neck when they wrapped her. I had not opened the chest since she died. I had thought about taking the key from the cord before the wrapping, but I could not do it. It seemed like a thing that would make the leaving final in a way I was not ready for, and so I left it, and that was how I came to not have the key. 4 years and I had not opened the chest. 4 years and it had become part of the wall, part of the mourning, part of the particular way I had learned to keep living without living all the way through. The night after the council ended, I sat by the fire for a long time and did not sleep. And somewhere in the dark before dawn, I found myself looking at the chest for the first time in I did not know how long, just looking at it. The copper hinges green in the firelight, the small lock. I am not a man who lets himself feel things he cannot do anything about. That is a habit of survival, and it has served me. But that night something moved in my chest that had not moved in a long time, something with edges, and I sat with it until the fire died, and then I lay down and stared at the smoke hole and waited for morning. It was the following week that she came back. She came to return the willow splint material which she had carefully cleaned and rolled. She said she thought I might use it again. She said this matter-of-factly, handing it to me, and I took it. We stood at the door of my lodge for a moment in the early cold, and I asked about the boy. Walking again, she said. Doesn't limp or not much. Good. She started to go, then she stopped. She turned back and she looked at me with those gray eyes of hers, the color of the sky when weather is coming, and she said, "Are you all right?" I said, "Yes." She said, "You don't look all right." I had not been spoken to that plainly by anyone in a long time. My people were careful with me because I was the chief, and because of walks with thunder, and because I had trained my face for long enough that most people took it at its surface. She had known me for exactly 2 visits, and she looked straight through the surface without appearing to try. I said, "There are things I carry." She said, "Yes, I know, me too." And then she left. I turned that over for days, the way she had said it. Not as comfort, not as pity, just as a fact between 2 people who had both been through something and knew it. An acknowledgement. Me too. 2 words, and she had put us on the same ground without making it into a ceremony. The next time I saw her was at the trading post in late October. She was arguing with Hanson, the trader, about the price he was offering for the furs her hired boy had trapped. She was right about the price. Hanson was cheating her by 1/3, and she was not raising her voice, but there was something in her stillness that reminded me of a river in freeze-up, that deceptive quiet before the ice takes full hold. I said the correct price to Hanson in the flattest voice I owned. He looked at me. He gave her the correct price. She paid for her goods. When she passed me going out, she said, quietly so only I could hear, "Thank you." And then she said, "You didn't have to do that." I said no. She looked at me for a moment. A small thing moved in the corner of her mouth, not quite a smile. She went out. I stood there long enough that Hanson said something to me, and I did not hear what it was. She started coming by after that. Not often, not with any design that I could see. She would be passing with the wagon and she would stop, and Emil would climb down and chase the camp dogs while she and I talked, or did not talk. Sometimes we sat at the fire in the long, early dark of November, and there was no need to fill the air. She had that quality of being easy with silence. Most people, when they are nervous or unsure of a situation, talk to cover the silence. She didn't. She let it be what it was. I noticed things about her. The way she held her hands when she was thinking, one wrapped around the other. The line between her brows when she was watching Emil and worrying about him without letting him see the worrying. The way she laughed when Emil did something that genuinely surprised her, sudden and full, and then pulled back, like she wasn't quite sure she was allowed. I noticed that she was a woman with her own interior life, her own weight, her own things she kept below the surface. I noticed she did not impose herself on anything. She was in my lodge and around my people with a kind of courtesy that was not performance. It came from something genuine, some understanding that she was a guest, and that being a guest well was a thing worth doing. I noticed also that she was beautiful. I had registered it the first day, but I had put it somewhere unreachable and did not take it back out. There are things a man in grief stores away because he does not trust himself with them yet. She was one of those things. I did not examine why I had stored her there either. Some knowledge comes before you're ready to name it. In December it snowed hard for 4 days. The kind of snow that changes the shape of everything, buries the familiar, makes the world into a different country. When it stopped, I rode out to check on the outlying families in the camp, and then, without fully deciding to, I turned the horse west toward Marin Halst's homestead. She was outside trying to dig out the barn door. The snow was to her waist in the drift that had built up against the south wall. She had a long-handled shovel and she was working steadily, methodically, without apparent frustration, just working the way she worked at everything, with a kind of plain seriousness that I had come to understand was simply how she was built. I tied the horse and took the shovel from her. She did not argue. She stood back and watched me work, and then she went and got a shorter spade from inside the barn and dug alongside me. We did not talk while we worked. The cold was significant. Our breath came in clouds. When the door was clear, she pushed it open, and the warmth of the animals came out and hit us both in the face. She said, "Come in out of the cold a minute." The barn was small, 2 horses and a milk cow and chickens in a box stall, warmer than the air outside by a long measure. She forked hay for the horses and I watched her, and the horses moved toward her the way animals do toward people they trust, pushing their long faces at her shoulders, and she spoke to them in that same low Norwegian, that old comfort language. Emil appeared from the ladder to the loft with straw in his hair. He looked at me and nodded in the way boys that age nod when they're trying to seem unimpressed by something that impresses them. His mother said, "Go get the biscuits from the tin on the stove and bring them out here." He went. She came and leaned on the stall rail beside me. She was close enough that I could feel the warmth coming off her. We both looked at the horses for a moment. She said, "My husband used to say that if you want to know a person, watch how their animals act around them." I said, "What did he think it meant when the animals came toward you?" She said, "He thought it meant you were safe." She didn't say anything after that. She didn't look at me, but she had put the thought in the air between us and she left it there, and I knew she had put it there on purpose. Emil came back with the biscuits, a whole tin of them, and we ate them standing in the warm barn with the animals shifting and the cold pressing against the walls outside. And the boy told me about a hawk he had been watching from the loft and asked me questions about hawks, serious, detailed questions, and I answered them as seriously as he asked them. When I answered the 3rd or 4th question, his mother caught my eye over his head and something passed between us. It was not a large thing. A kind of acknowledgement, "I see how you are with him. He is good with you." I left before dark. Riding back I thought about what she had said, safe, her husband's theory. I rode slowly. I was not in a hurry to be back in my lodge. The months that came after moved at their own pace. Winter loosened its grip in February slowly, the way it does on the northern plains when it's not quite ready to be done with you. There were hard nights still, nights when the temperature dropped back and the wind came off the flats with a meanness that surprised you even though you'd lived through 30 winters of it. She came to the winter dances. Someone must have invited her. I didn't know who. She came with Emil and she sat where she was told to sit and she watched without the stiffness or the poorly hidden discomfort that most settlers showed at such things, the performance of tolerance. She just watched, genuinely, with the kind of attention you give something you find interesting and real. Afterward she told me, she had heard drums before but not like that. She said it differently than people usually said things like that. She didn't make it into a compliment she was giving me, like it was for my benefit. She said it quietly, to herself almost, like she was just registering a true thing. I said, what did they sound like before? She thought about it, she said, like announcement, like something being declared. Yours felt like inside something, like the sound was the place and not about the place. I looked at her for a moment. I said, that is exactly right. She shrugged a little, like she didn't know what to do with being told she was right about something. I recognized that shrug. I had seen that same motion in people who had spent a long time not being asked what they thought. There was a night in March, the ground beginning to soften, the light lasting a little longer each evening, when she came by the camp alone. Emil was staying with a neighbor woman, she said. She had ridden over herself, just her on the gray horse that was too big for her, and she came into my lodge and sat down and I made coffee and we sat across the fire. She said, I need to tell you something. I waited. She said, I've been thinking about you, more than is probably sensible. I did not say anything. She said, I'm not asking you for anything. I know what I am and what you are and I know how people look at things. I thought it was unfair not to tell you. It seemed dishonest not to. I looked at the fire for a while. She sat still on her side of it and waited, because she was someone who knew how to wait. I said, I've been thinking about you too. She looked at me. I said, I don't know what to do with it. There are things, I have things still, she was. I stopped. She nodded slowly like she had expected this, like she knew what the unsaid word was. She said, I know. Tor has been gone 2 years and there are mornings I still reach across the bed, so I know. Then she said, I'm not asking you to be over it. I'm not asking you to be anywhere you're not. I said, what are you asking? She looked at me steadily. She said, I'm asking if I can stay, just in whatever way makes sense. I'll let you determine what that is. I had not been asked that before. I had been around people who wanted things from me, advice, decisions, help, authority, my name on something. She was asking permission to be present, on my terms, as a thing I could have a say in. I sat with that for a long time. I said I would like that. She nodded. She stayed another hour and we talked about small things, the horses, the spring planting, a story about Emil that made me laugh for the first time in I didn't know how long. And then she left and I sat by the fire after she was gone and thought about what had just happened and what it meant and what it didn't mean yet and what it might become. The chest was in the corner. I looked at it. It was April when the thing with the chest happened. She had come for 3 evenings in a row, which was new, and on the 3rd evening she arrived just after dark with a pot of something she had made, a stew, thick and good-smelling. And she set it on the fire and sat down and noticed the chest the way she noticed things, without making a show of it. She said, that's old cedar, you can smell it still. I said it was my wife's. She said, I know, someone in the camp told me. She didn't ask about it. She went back to adjusting the pot over the fire. That was her way. She would name a thing and then leave it alone, give you the space to come toward it yourself if you were going to come toward it at all. We ate. The stew was good. Emil had sent a drawing with her, a hawk, done carefully with charcoal on a scrap of paper, and I held it and looked at it for a while and set it down somewhere I would see it. After we had eaten and the fire had settled into coals, she said, still not looking at the chest, looking at the fire, she said, you don't have to. But if you ever wanted to open it, I could. There are ways to open a lock without the key. My father was a blacksmith. He taught me. I looked at her. She said, just so you know, the option exists. Not tonight. whenever, or never if that's right. I said, how long have you known how to do that? She said, since I was 9. I said, and you just thought to mention it. She looked at me then. She said, I mentioned it because I thought you might have wanted to open it 1,000 times and talked yourself out of it. And I thought maybe if someone else knew the door could open, it would be easier to decide. I sat with that for a long time. Then I got up and I brought the chest to the fire, and I set it between us. She looked at it, she looked at me. I said not tonight, but soon. She nodded. She reached out and put her hand on my hand. That was all. Her hand on my hand for just a moment, and then she pulled it back. I felt that hand for a long time after she had gone. It was 2 weeks later. An evening in late April, the air warming up, the prairie beginning to green at the edges, that first faint color coming back after the long brown of winter. She came just before dusk, and I had the chest already out from the corner, already sitting near the fire. She saw it and she did not say anything, just sat down near it. She had a small leather roll with her, tied with a cord. She opened it on the ground between us. Inside, a row of thin metal tools, small, delicate, things her father had made and she had kept. She lifted the iron lock and examined it in the firelight. She said, this is a simple ward lock, old, your wife's grandmother's time. I can open it in a few minutes. I said, all right. She worked quietly. I watched her hands. She was completely focused, those gray eyes close to the lock, turning the tools with a patience that was the same patience she brought to everything. Outside, a night bird was doing something in the willows along the creek. The fire ticked. The lock opened. She set it down. She did not open the chest. She sat back and she looked at me. I leaned forward, and I opened the chest myself. The smell came first. Cedar and something older underneath, the specific smell of walks with Thunder's things, her hands, her life, stored in the dark for 4 years. I was not prepared for that smell. It hit me the way physical things hit you, in the body before the mind, and I sat with it. The piece of blue ribbon, the letters in that script I could not read, a dozen of them tied with a strip of hide. The small carved horse with its thick legs. I picked it up. The wood was smooth where she had handled it 1,000 times, worn to a kind of polish that was better than any polish I could have given it. I set it down on my knee. Marin did not say anything. She sat across the fire and she let me be in this. She did not comfort me, did not reach for me, did not try to fill what was happening with words or touch. She was just there, present in the way that sometimes presence is the whole thing, the entire gift, just a person staying in the room while you go through something. I sat with the carved horse on my knee for a long time. Then I looked up at her. She was looking at me with something in her face that I had not seen directed at me in 4 years. Not pity, not discomfort, just recognition. The look that says, I see you in this. I am not turning away from this part of you. I said she would have liked you. Marin said, that is a good thing to hear. I said, I mean it. She had no patience for people who couldn't be straight with her. You would have gotten along. Marin said, what was she like? So I told her. I sat by the fire with the carved horse in my hand, and I talked about walks with Thunder in a way I had not talked about her since she died. Not the careful, ceremonial talk of grief, but the real talk, the particular talk, the way she laughed at herself when she made a mistake. The argument we had once about a horse that went on for 3 days because neither of us was wrong and neither of us would say so. The way she sang when she was working, low and slightly off the note she was aiming for. And she knew it and she didn't care. Marin listened, all of it. She asked questions, real ones, specific ones that meant she was actually listening and not just waiting to say something. When I stopped talking, she was quiet for a moment. She said, she sounds like she was worth loving. I said she was. We sat with that. Then Marin said, I think she's still worth loving. I think that doesn't have to stop. I looked at her. She said, I'm not asking to replace her. I want to be clear about that. I'm asking to be something in addition, whatever that means, whatever shape it takes. I said, you know what this means. Between a Lakota chief and a white settler widow, what people will say. She said, I know what people will say. I've been the subject of what people say since Tor died and I started breaking sod myself instead of selling the land and going back east. I'm still here. I'll manage what people say. I said, it's more than talk, for me, for my people. She said, I know, I've thought about that. I'm not asking you to make it simple or to make it easy or to pretend there aren't real things to consider. I'm asking if it's possible. Is it possible? I looked at the fire for a while. I looked at the carved horse in my hand, at the letters in Walks with Thunder's grandmother's script, at the blue ribbon. I put the carved horse back in the chest. I laid the ribbon across it. I set the letters in. I did not close the lid. I said, yes, it's possible. She held very still for a moment. Then she breathed out, slow, like she'd been holding that breath for some time. She said, okay. Just that, okay. Not a celebration, not a declaration, just okay. This is a thing we are deciding. We have decided it. I put my hand across the fire and she took it, and we stayed like that for a while, her hand in mine across the coals, and neither of us felt the need to say anything more. Summer came. Things had their own pace, their own complications, their own slow working out. The camp was not unified in how they received what was happening. There were those who understood, those who were wary, one old man who said to my face that I was dishonoring Walks with Thunder, which I thought about for several days before I decided he was wrong. Walks with Thunder had known, better than anyone, that life goes on requiring you to participate in it. She would not have called my living a dishonor. She was not that kind of woman. Among the settlers there were difficulties too, of a different kind. Looks at the trading post. A woman who had been friendly to Marin suddenly not friendly. One of the men who farmed to the south came and talked to Marin. I heard about it from her and told her things that were not quite threats but were close to it. She told him to leave her land. He left. She told me this the same way she told me everything, plainly, without drama as information. I said, are you afraid? She said, of him. No, of other things, yes, but not of him. I said, what other things? She said, that I'll make things harder for you than they should be, that the cost of this land's harder on your side than on mine. I think about that. I said, I can carry what comes to me. She said, I know you can. That's not what I'm worried about. I said, don't worry on my behalf about whether I can bear things. That is not a useful thing to do. She looked at me for a moment. Then she said, you sound like my mother. I said, was your mother right? She said, almost always. It was annoying. I said, then let me be annoying. She laughed. That full, sudden laugh that got pulled back before it could go too far. But this time she let it go a little further than usual. I noticed that. Emil, through all of this, was his own education. Boys that age take things in without appearing to. He had been watching me since the first day his mother brought him with the broken ankle, filing things away, making his private assessments. By midsummer he had stopped his careful impression of indifference and begun simply being present the way his mother was present. Easy, direct, asking real questions, willing to work. He helped me with the horses one morning, a long morning, handing me tools and doing what he was asked without needing to be told twice, and at the end of it he said, without looking at me, I'm glad my mother has someone to talk to. I said, she's good at talking. He said she doesn't usually talk, not real talking. She used to with my dad. He was 8 years old and he had told me something important. I sat with it. I said, she talks to me. He said, I know. I can tell by how she looks when she comes home. I thought about that for the rest of the day, how she looks when she comes home. There was a thing that happened in August that I will not tell in full because it involves other people and other decisions, and it is not mine to tell in detail. What I will say is that it was a council matter, a hard one, a thing where I had to stand in a place I did not want to stand and hold a position that cost me something. Afterward, I rode a long way out on the flats, and I sat on my horse in the high summer grass, and I did not feel the greatness of having done the right thing that people in stories feel. I felt tired. I felt the particular tiredness that comes from spending yourself on something necessary. I rode back at dusk. Marin was at my lodge. She had not known I was coming back that evening. She had come for her own reasons, or maybe for no reason, maybe just because she had learned that sometimes being in the place where someone might return is enough. She looked at my face when I came in and she said nothing. She put water on for coffee. She sat across the fire. She let me sit with the tiredness until some of it drained away. After a while she said, "Do you want to tell me what happened?" I said, "Not tonight." She said, "Okay." That was all. Not pressure, not hurt at being left out. Just okay. I'll be here when you want to tell it, or I'll be here if you never want to tell it. I looked at her across the fire. I said, "Why do you keep coming back?" She said, "What do you mean?" I said, "It's not simple. It costs you things. The woman at the trading post, the man to the south, your own neighbors looking at you a certain way. Why do you keep coming back?" She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Because when I'm here I feel like myself. And I went a long time not feeling like myself after Tor died. I was managing things. I was functioning. I was being what Emil needed. But I wasn't in my own skin, quite. And then I came into your lodge that first day with my boy in my arms, and you looked at me like you were just going to deal with the actual situation in front of you. No ceremony, no performance, and something in me relaxed. For the first time in 2 years." She looked at the fire. She said, "I keep coming back because being with you is the only place I don't have to manage anything. I can just be in it." I said, "That is what I feel too, when you are here." She looked at me. I said, "I carried that chest for 4 years because I couldn't open it and couldn't put it away. You came in and you opened it, and you didn't ask me to do anything about it afterward. You just let it be open." She said, "That's what you needed." I said, "I didn't know that until you did it." We sat with that, the fire, the summer night outside making its sounds, the chest in the corner with its lid still not closed, walks with Thunder's things inside it, there and present and not a wound anymore, just a part of the room. I got up and I moved around the fire and I sat beside her, close enough that our shoulders touched. She did not move toward me or away from me. She just stayed still and let the touching be what it was. We sat like that for a long time. Then she put her head against my shoulder, just slightly, the way a person does when they have finally stopped holding themselves up so hard. And I put my arm around her, and she settled in against my side. And outside the summer dark was full of sound, and the fire was low and warm, and I sat there with this woman's weight against me, and felt something I had not felt in 4 years. Not healed, not fixed, not over anything I had been through, just present, fully in the moment I was in, not somewhere else managing myself through it. She said very quietly, "Is this all right?" I said, "Yes." She said, "Okay." That word again, just okay. Like she was always settling things, quietly, one small thing at a time, without needing them to be larger than they were. I thought about walks with Thunder, about what she would think of this woman's head against my shoulder. I thought she would recognize something, that she would see the quality in Marin that I saw, the plain directness, the patience, the willingness to be in a hard thing and not flinch from it. I thought she would nod at me in that way she had, that slight nod that meant she approved but wasn't going to say so out loud because she figured I could figure it out. I think I had been waiting for that nod. The fall came the way it always comes on the northern plains, fast and with authority. The grass went yellow. The cottonwoods threw their leaves all at once like they'd agreed on it. and the air took on that cold clarity that I have always loved, the light going amber and sideways across the prairie, and everything it touches looking more itself than it does at any other time of year. She began gradually to be a presence in the camp in a way that was recognized and accepted, if not by everyone, then by enough. The women who had been cautious became less cautious. One of them, a woman called Bright Stone, who had known me since I was a young man, told me flatly one morning that Maren Halst was a good woman, and that I should not be stupid about it. I told her I intended not to be. Emil wintered well. He grew 2 inches between September and March, went from skinny to something approaching what he'd actually be, and his ankle was completely his own again, no limp at all. He learned some Lakota words, not from me, from the boys in the camp, the practical words that boys teach each other, words for running and horses and specific insults, and one word that made his mother's eyes go flat when she heard him use it. He learned what that one meant. The winter was easier than the winter before. I do not mean the weather, which was hard in its usual ways. I mean the interior weather. I slept better. I ate better. I thought more clearly in the council, or at least with less of my attention split off somewhere else managing grief. When I rode out alone on the flats, I was riding and thinking about what I was looking at, not somewhere else. There was a morning in November when the first real cold came in, the kind that arrives overnight and does not apologize, and I rode out before light to check on the horses we had pastured north of the camp. The prairie that morning was something. The light came up slow and gray, and the frost was on everything, on every stalk of dead grass and every stone, and the sky went from black to a particular bruised blue, and then to the flat white of a morning that means business. I sat on my horse and watched it come. I had not watched a morning come that way in a long time, just watched it, with no particular plan running in the back of my mind, no grief working underneath it. Just the light and the frost and the horse's breath in the cold, and the silence that the plains have before the day starts up, a silence that is not empty but full of the sound of the land being itself. I thought about walks with thunder. I thought about the way she used to say that the old people told you to watch the light come up because the light knew things the dark didn't. She believed that, or she half believed it, which with her was close enough. I thought, what would you tell me if you could tell me something? The light came all the way up. The frost began to let go of the grass coming back into its color. A hawk moved somewhere to the north of me, a small dark point against the white sky. I don't know what she would have told me. I think she would have told me to stop sitting on a horse in the cold trying to ask the light something and go back and eat breakfast. She had a gift for the practical, even in her more philosophical moments. She would have said something sharp and funny, and I would have laughed and gone back. I went back. Maren was at the fire when I came in. She had come early, let herself in, started coffee, which she had begun to do with the easy authority of someone who has made herself at home in a place and been told in enough ways that this is all right. She handed me coffee without asking if I wanted it. I sat down and drank it. She said, "You were out early." I said, "Checking the horses." She said, "Were they all right?" I said, "They were fine. I stayed longer than I needed to." She said, "I know, I saw you out there from the ridge, just sitting on the horse." I said, "You were watching." She said, "I was walking. I happened to be going that direction. I didn't disturb you because you looked like you were occupied." I said, "I was trying to ask the light something." She considered this without any sign that it struck her as odd. She said, "Did it answer?" I said, "No, but it was a good morning to ask." She nodded. She drank her coffee. She said, "I do that too. I talk to Tor sometimes when I'm out by myself, not because I think he answers, just because it seems like it should be said, whatever I was going to tell him." I said, "What do you tell him?" She thought about it. She said, "The practical things, what Emil is doing, what the land needs." "Sometimes I tell him he'd like you. I told him that the second time I came here, actually." I said, Tor, this is a man you'd have liked." I looked at her. She shrugged, like it's true, so I said it. I said, "What do you think he said back?" She said, "I think he said probably. He was careful with his opinions about people until he knew them, but probably." Marin and I had a fight in December. A real one. Something about a decision I had made without consulting her that affected something that mattered to her. She told me plainly and with some heat that I had done that wrong. I told her, also with some heat, that it was my decision to make. She said that was true, but that it being mine to make didn't mean I couldn't have asked. I sat with that for 2 days before I admitted she was right. I told her so and she said, "I know, but thank you for saying it." That is the fight I remember. There were others, smaller ones, the friction of two people with strong habits who have come to each other late. But that first one I remember because of what came after. Not a resolution, not a ceremony. Just, "I was wrong, I know, thank you." And then the fire and the coffee and the ordinary evening. Two people doing the ordinary evening together. That is the thing. There is a thing I should say about that winter, about something that happened in January that I have not spoken of to many people. The man from the south, the one who had come to Marin's land, came to the camp. He came with 2 others, and they came in the way men come when they want something from you, and have decided the thing they want is also the thing you owe them, which is a particular kind of arrogance that I have spent my whole life dealing with in one form or another. He said to me, in the hearing of several of my men, that what was happening with the woman Halst was a disgrace, and that if it continued, there would be consequences for the camp. He used the word consequences in a way that was meant to sound large and official, like he was reading from some authority. He was a big man, red-faced, with the manner of someone who had found out early that size and volume could move most obstacles out of his path. I let him finish. Then I said, "The woman Halst is here by her own choice. What she does on her own land and in her own time is her concern and mine, and not yours. If you come to this camp again with this kind of talk, you will leave without your horse." He looked at me for a long moment. The 2 men with him did not know quite where to put themselves. He said, "You can't." I said, "I have just told you what I can. Leave." He left. He did not come back. I told Marin what had happened and she was quiet for a moment. She said, "You didn't have to do that." I said, "He came to my camp." She said, still, "You didn't have to make it as plain as you made it." I said, "He needed it plain." She looked at me with something in her face that was complicated, gratitude and worry together, which is how she often looked when I did something on her behalf, like she was glad of the thing and troubled by what it cost me at the same time. She said, "Does it make things harder for you, with the agent, with the government men?" I said, "Everything makes things harder with the government men. That is a constant. I do not make my decisions based on what makes things easier with the government men." She said, "That's probably wise." I said, "It is not wise exactly. It is just, I am not going to stop being myself in order to manage their comfort. I was done with that before you arrived." She thought about that. She said, "Tor was the same way. He used to say a man who manages everyone else's comfort never gets around to his own life." I said, "Your husband sounds like he knew something." She said, "He knew a lot of things. He died young and it was a waste, and I still think about it that way, as a waste. A good man wasted." She did not say it with self-pity. She said it the way she said things that were simply true and needed saying. I said, "I am sorry for that loss. I mean it." She said, "I know you do, because you know what it is." We sat for a while. She said, "I sometimes think about the 2 of them, walks with Thunder and Tor, whether they'd have had anything to say to each other." I said, "What do you think?" She thought about it seriously. She said, "I think they'd have been suspicious of each other at first. And then I think they'd have found something, some ground, because they were both people who actually looked at things. You know, not people who performed at things, they looked." I said that is true of her, yes. She said, I think people like that always find each other eventually, whether it's here or somewhere else. I sat with that for a long time. The following spring, the second spring of this, she came one morning early, before I expected her. I was outside looking at the horses and she rode up and she had something in her hand, held carefully, a small package wrapped in cloth. She got down from the gray horse and she stood in front of me. She said, I had this made. She held out the package, I took it. Inside the cloth was a key. Iron, small, old-fashioned in its shape. She had described the lock to a blacksmith somewhere, and he had cut a key that fit it. I held it in my hand. It was warm from being in her hand. She said, you still might not want to use it, that's fine. It's just I thought you should have one, in case. I looked at the key, I looked at her. I said, where did you? She said, there's a man in Bismarck who does locks. He cut 3 of them because he wasn't sure which would work. I tried all 3 on the lock last time I was here and this one turns. She had tried the lock. While I was out somewhere she had sat at the chest and tried 3 keys until she found the one that worked. Not to open it without me, just to find the right one. I closed my hand around the key. She was watching my face, those gray eyes steady. She was not doing anything with her face, not performing concern, not asking for a reaction, just watching. I said, come here. She came. I put my arm around her and she put both her hands against my chest, and we stood like that in the spring morning with the horses moving behind us and the new grass coming in, and the wide sky doing what the Dakota sky does in spring. That enormous blue that seems to go up farther than sky has any right to go. She was not tall. Her head came to my shoulder. I could feel her hands against my chest, the weight of them. I said, you came all the way to Bismarck. She said it wasn't that far. I said, that is not the point. She said very quiet, I know it isn't. We stood there for a while. I said, I want you to know something. She waited. I said, you gave me something back that I had stopped thinking I would have again. I don't have a name for it. Being fully in my own life, maybe. Looking at what's in front of me and not somewhere else. She was my wife and she was my life for 14 years and that will not change and I'm not asking it to change. But I have been in the dark for 4 years. And you came in with your boy in your arms and your straight eyes and your Norwegian stubbornness and your knowledge of locks, and you have been here, consistently, without asking me to be anywhere other than where I am. I stopped. I said that has mattered to me, considerably. She said, I'm glad. Then she said, you did the same for me, you know. You didn't try to make it simple. You didn't pretend the complications away. You were straight with me, and I hadn't had that not from a man since Tor. She looked up at me. She said, you're a good man, Standing Elk. I want you to know that I know that. I held the key in my hand, and I held her with my other arm, and above us the big sky went on being what it was, indifferent and vast and lit up in a way that had nothing to do with us, and everything to do with why we were standing in it. Later inside, I put the key in the chest, on top of the blue ribbon next to the carved horse with its thick legs. I did not close the lid. I have not closed it since. The chest sits in the corner and the lid is open and the smell of cedar comes out now and then when the air moves through. Marin says she likes the smell. I believe her. Emil is 11 now and he says he wants to learn to ride the way the Lakota ride, which is the way I ride, and I have started teaching him. He falls off with considerable frequency and a thoroughness that impresses me. He gets up and gets back on without being told to, which impresses me more. His mother watches from the fence, arms folded, her brow in that line it goes to when she is worried but not saying so. Sometimes she glances at me and I meet her eyes and she relaxes, a little. She trusts me with what she loves. That is not a small thing. I try not to treat it like one. What I know is this. I was a man with a locked chest and no key, and I had made a kind of peace with never opening it. And then this woman came and showed me the door could open, and when it opened it didn't break me the way I thought it might. It opened, and the smell came out, and it was her, and it was grief, and it was walks with thunder, and it was spring, and it was the particular amber light of late afternoon on the northern plains, and it was this gray-eyed woman who came to Bismarck for a key. I have been in my own life fully since then. That is what she gave me. She handed it back with both hands. The fire is low. Somewhere in the willows the night bird has started up again. Marin is asleep in the way she sleeps, completely, heavily, one arm across the blanket, and the chest is in the corner with its lid up and the key inside it, and the sky out the smoke hole has gone to the deep black that comes before the stars clarify. I am not young. My knees talk to me in cold weather, and there are mornings when the years live in my hands and I have to work them open slowly. I have buried my wife. I have watched my people lose things that cannot be named simply or quickly. I have stood in bad places and held positions that cost me, and I will stand in more. And I have this woman, this fire, this particular night, the chest open, the key inside it. A man does not ask for more than what he has when what he has is enough. He sits in it. He pays attention to it. He lets the weight of it settle in his hands like the carved horse, smooth from being held. That is all. That is everything.